Right, well, I just want to say a few words about why I think the great books are important, and more than that, why they're worth looking into. I start by pointing out that we human beings, are not like animals. That is to say, we don't live completely submerged in the present. We are self-conscious as well as conscious, and we can stand outside the present moment. We can relate ourselves to the past, indeed we do relate ourselves to the past, and we speculate about the future. Now, in doing this relating and speculating about the past and future from, in a sense, a position outside the present, we try to make sense of our lives, of who we are, where we're going, what we're doing, in the light of our past, present, and future. And from this reflective standpoint, we rely on narratives and myths, and we indeed embroider narratives and myths for ourselves, which reflect our humanity, our concerns, our fears, and our hopes, and indeed much else. Now, we all do this all the time in a somewhat informal way, but what we think of nowadays as the great books are narratives which have lasted for a long time, which have been embroidered in some cases over centuries, and which have survived. And these are narratives in which the people telling these things have themselves responded to their existence as reflective beings, creating narratives for themselves, and of course, in the case of books and myths and stories, for others. Now, I said that the great books are narratives which have survived. Now, I think this is very important because it means that people from times and places other than where they were composed, where they were originally written, have been interested in them and have been captivated by them. And what I want to say about this has, I think, been very well encapsulated by David Hume, the philosopher Hume, in a short essay he wrote called Of the Standard of Taste. And in this essay, Hume says, and I'm now going to read from it, "The same Homer who pleased at Athens and at Rome 2,000 years ago is still admired at Paris and London. All the changes of climate, government, religion, and language have not been able to obscure his glory. Authority and prejudice may give a temporary vogue to a bad poet or orator, but his reputation will never be durable or general. When his compositions are examined by posterity or by foreigners, the enchantment is dissipated and his faults appear in their true colors." Now, of course, most of us, most of the time, are surrounded by and influenced by the fashion and enchantment of our own time. But when we think of works which have survived, the very fact they have survived and are still read, studied, thought about, enjoyed today, in some cases hundreds if not thousands of years after their creation, this shows that they're not purely a matter of the fashion or circumstances of their time. Most works simply reflect the fashions of their time, and in the future they will go, they won't survive. But some things have survived, and if only for that reason, are worth studying. Now, I will just say something very briefly about two works, which I think to some extent illustrate the point I'm making. The first, or the point Hume is making, the first of these works is Homer's Iliad, which is perhaps in the Western tradition the first and maybe the greatest of the great books. Now, very interestingly, Homer's Iliad is a national epic. Indeed, it is, well, it's become universal. It was, or is, the national epic of, well, what we call Greece. In the Iliad, the Greeks are called the Achaeans. Amazingly, for a national epic, in Homer's Iliad, the Greeks are not the heroes. Perhaps the Trojans aren't the heroes either, exactly. It is amazingly even-handed. In some ways, the Trojans, or some of them, are more admirable, some of them. And what is depicted in the Iliad by Homer is a great crime. It is the events that lead up to the destruction of Troy. And in the Iliad, there are beautiful descriptions of the life of peace and plenty that exist within the city of Troy, where the Greeks are, of course, encamped on the outside, on the plain. But this is going to be destroyed, and everybody knows that. Well, certainly everybody who heard Homer knows that. So it's leading up to something which is the destruction of something that should not be destroyed. Furthermore, the Iliad ends with Achilles, who is the most ruthless hero of the Greeks, mourning the loss of his friend Patroclus and expressing sympathy to some extent with the king of Troy, Priam, whose son Hector Achilles has just killed. So I think just making those very minor points about Homer show you that this national epic has a kind of universality and a bearing on life way beyond the life or the time in which it was composed. Now, this, of course, became a staple epic, a staple document when it was written for the Greeks, the Romans, and many other people since. So traces of the Iliad are to be found in much of what follows, which is another interesting aspect of a book that becomes a great book. Other people incorporate it, or elements of it, try to rework it and introduce it into their own writing in their own place and time. One of the most famous people who did this, of course, was Virgil in Roman times, just before the birth of Christ. But I said I'd mention one other great book. I'll mention the great book of the Portuguese, the Lusíads, Os Lusíadas of Camões. Now, I'm sure you all know this, probably know it much better than me, but one of the fascinating aspects of the Lusíads is that in it, Camões is intentionally playing off Virgil, and he uses many of the scenes and incidents and kind of feeling that you get from Virgil, who himself is drawing very extensively on Homer in the Aeneid, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And you could easily trace the whole setup of the Lusíads back to Virgil and then back further to Homer. So that's just a small example of how one great book, perhaps the greatest of all, has had great influence not only on Virgil, which everybody is well aware of, but also here or there. I mean, I'm in England, but with you in Portugal, in the Lusíads, which also has survived and become embodied in the lives and feelings of people in Portugal. It's a narrative that transcends its place and time. It is indeed a great book.